The Whiskey Tax and the Whiskey Rebellion. Most people were pleased when George Washington agreed to run for election for a second four-year term as president in 1792. Washington agreed to run again to prevent the formation of political parties that would fight each other over the country's serious economic problems. The government was collecting money through taxes on imports, but was not collecting enough money to pay for its bonds. In 1794, the wealthy Business People's Party, who still had a majority in Congress, passed a 25% tax on whiskey to raise more money to pay for the government's bonds. The problem with the whiskey tax. Farmers who owned small farms in the hilly areas west away from the coast were very angry about this tax. Farmers made much of their income from selling whiskey. They made whiskey because their main crops were grains, like corn. Grain is heavy to transport long distances to markets. Grain can be made into whiskey, which is a much higher value. So farmers made more money from whiskey, which was cheaper to transport. The whiskey tax hurt farmers because only farmers paid the tax. When the farmers sold their whiskey, they had to pay 25% of the money they received to the government. If a farmer sold $40 worth of liquor, he had to pay a tax of $10 to the government. The whiskey tax was an example of a government policy that taxed the ordinary people more than it did the wealthy business people. The Whiskey Rebellion. In western Pennsylvania, the farmers felt that the whiskey tax was just as unfair as the stamp tax had been. Violence erupted. Farmers tarred and feathered some federal tax collectors, covering them in hot tar and then throwing chicken feathers on top of the tar. The violence frightened some of the tax collectors so much that they quit their jobs. You may remember that the Sons of Liberty had punished the stamp tax collectors in the same way a few years before. Some farmers refused to pay the tax. Farmers who were protesting the whiskey tax destroyed the whiskey-making machinery of those farmers who did pay the tax. Farmers also marched into courtrooms and stopped judges from trying farmers who didn't pay the tax. Thousands of farmers marched through Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, protesting the whiskey tax. The viewpoint of the wealthy people who was that the farmers' protest was a rebellion. It was treason against the new country. The wealthy business people remembered Shays' Rebellion 8 years earlier and wondered if the federal government would be strong enough to stop the sometimes violent protests. President Washington did not want the protests to become more violent. He gathered an army of 13,000 soldiers from militias in several states. The president, who had been commander-in-chief during the Revolutionary War, personally led the army into western Pennsylvania, where the rebelling farmers lived. The farmers, who saw they were outnumbered, didn't try to fight. They gave in and agreed to pay the tax. Only a few farmers were arrested and convicted of treason. Alexander Hamilton wanted 2 of these farmers executed, but President Washington pardoned them. Pardon means to release a person from having to pay the penalty for a crime. Effects of the Whiskey Rebellion. One effect of the Whiskey Rebellion was that the government, under President Washington, had proven its strength. Wealthy people supported the government even more. However, many people thought that the government had been too harsh. It should have heard the farmers' complaints. Because the government did not listen, another effect was that many more people were opposed to the Federalist Party.